We're so glad that you all are here joining us today. My name is Lakeland Hogan. I'm Home Instead Senior Care's gerontologist and caregiver advocate, and I am joined by a few guests today on today's live chat. So I'll formally introduce them in just a few minutes, but we have two individuals that work for the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. We have Matt Sharp and Dina Chisholm. Is that right, Dina?
Yep, Chisholm.
So we'll formally introduce you guys in just a moment, but I want to know where everyone is coming from. We have so many different people that are joining us from across the country. Sometimes we even have international people logging into these live chats. So I'm here in Omaha, Nebraska. Matt, where are you coming to us from today?
I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Awesome. And then Dina, where are you based?
I'm actually in the state of Delaware.
Awesome. So looks like we have Jennifer joining us from Salem, Oregon. Hi, Jennifer. We're excited to have you with us. It's so fun to have people coming together from across the country to talk about, today we're going to be talking about FTD. So excited to have a bunch of people joining us. We have Isabel from Ottawa, Canada. So this officially just became an international chat. I love it. So we love to hear where you're coming from today. We have Gwen here in Omaha. She's my colleague. Hi, Gwen. I'm so glad that she joined us today. We have another Ontario individual joining us. We have Linda from Montana. This is so fun. I love seeing where everyone's coming from. So we have lots of people joining us. We're so glad that you're all here. And so I'm going to get us started here in just a couple moments. Again, my name is Lakeland Hogan, gerontologist and caregiver advocate for Home Instead Senior Care. And you're joining us for our Caregiver Chat series brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care. And before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment. I know we're here to talk about FTD and caregiving tips and answer questions for our family caregivers. But with COVID-19 or the coronavirus being at the forefront of the news right now, we really hope that this is a learning opportunity that comes as a welcome distraction amongst everything that's going on. We do know that, again, this is a hot topic right now, but for the purpose of this chat, we're not going to address specific questions about COVID-19. We really encourage you to go to reputable sources such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and the World Health Organization for guidance on preventing the spread of this illness. And really, the most important thing we should all be doing is washing our hands, staying home when we're sick, and following precautions if we're caring for someone who is sick. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, but again, encourage you to seek out information from reputable sources. So on these chats, we typically focus on dementia, and oftentimes we talk about Alzheimer's disease, but we know that while Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, there are a lot of other types of dementias out there that people have been diagnosed with and that caregivers are caring for. So I really wanted to talk today with some individuals who know a lot about one of the most common types of dementia for people under the age of 60, and that's frontotemporal degeneration. And while it is widely affecting people under the age of 60, it's widely misunderstood and often misdiagnosed. So today I'm very excited to be joined by Matt and Dina from the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, who are going to just share a wealth of information and resources with us. So before we get started, I just wanted to quickly introduce each of you. But first, thank you both so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so Matt, I'm going to introduce you first. Matt Sharp is the program manager for the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. He plays a key role in patient and caregiver support and education. He's helped develop AFTD's grassroots network that's made up of local volunteers who raise funds to ensure the help and support of families as well as research. And then we're also joined by Dina Chisholm. She serves as AFTD's education program manager, working primarily with healthcare professionals, promoting AFTD's mission and providing education. In her career, she's worked to develop and implement several new initiatives and research focused on dementia care. So again, welcome to both of you. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks.
Thanks. This is great to be here.
Wonderful. So I know we're going to kick it off with a little discussion. And before we do, I forgot to go over some housekeeping items. So just so everyone knows, we are muting all of your lines and we're recording this. So if you are working from home like the three of us are, don't worry about the dog barking or the kids running in the background. We can't hear you on our end, but we will record this. So if you happen to miss part of it or want to pass it along or to someone who can't join us, or if you want to rewatch it, it will be made available on our website and on our social media platforms. We do have several social media platforms, so if you're joining us on one of our Facebook pages, Help for Alzheimer's Families, or Remember for Alzheimer's Families, pardon me, or Caregiver Stress, we encourage you to chat in your questions below this live stream video. And then if you're joining us from Zoom, we will be taking your questions live in this platform as well, so feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. You can type in the questions at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. But thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you. And so now I would love to start our discussion about FTD, frontotemporal degeneration. So first, Dina, if you wouldn't mind, could you just kind of give us an overview of FTD and how it is different from Alzheimer's disease? As I mentioned, Alzheimer's disease gets a lot of press, it gets a lot of attention, but we do know that it is different from other types of dementia. So if you could kick off our conversation with that, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So dementia is usually where we start. It's the largest umbrella term, and dementia is really describing a change in behavior and cognition that affects how a person functions in their day-to-day life. So under the umbrella of dementia care, there are different things that can cause those changes in behavior and cognition. Some of those things are actually reversible, meaning they can be medically treated and reversed. But when we're talking about neurodegenerative disorders like FTD, these are progressive diseases in which there are no treatment and get worse over time. And the most common of these progressive neurodegenerative diseases is Alzheimer's disease. So if we think to the broad dementia umbrella, not only do we have Alzheimer's disease under there, but we have a smaller umbrella under there, which we'll call FTD. So FTD itself is another umbrella term. So it represents a group of several progressive diseases that affect the same parts of the brain, which are the frontal and the temporal lobes, and all the neural pathways in between them. So the frontal lobes of the brain are really involved in a number of different kinds of functioning, including personality, behavior, planning, reasoning, judgment, impulses, and motor control. And temporal lobes of the brain are involved in language, memory, and speech. So FTD is a result of disease in these particular parts of the brain. So how is it different from Alzheimer's disease, right? So FTD is a younger onset disorder. So it's the most common form of dementia for people under 60, which we kind of talked about and you mentioned before, Lakeland. People generally experience onset of FTD symptoms about mid-50s, but it can occur in people as early as 20 or as late as their 80s. There are some who experience younger onset Alzheimer's disease, but Alzheimer's disease typically grows more common with increasing age. The younger onset in FTD disorders is one of the hallmark characteristics of FTD. And then when we generally think about Alzheimer's disease, we generally think about it as a memory disorder, right? Memory being the hallmark symptom of that disease. Memory loss tends to be a more prominent symptom of Alzheimer's disease, and those parts of the brain that are involved in memory are affected first and foremost. But in FTD, not so much, right? FTD is not primarily a memory disorder. In fact, memory is relatively preserved in those who have FTD. In FTD, the earliest symptoms are associated with functions, again, carried out by the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, right? And those are usually identified as progressive behavior or personality or language declines, and in some cases, some motor declines too. Um, However, in advanced FTD, there can be some memory loss, but that's going to be in addition to the more characteristic effects of FTD, which are the behavior, the language, and movement. But again, primarily, memory is not a prominent hallmark symptom of FTD. Lastly, FTD differs from Alzheimer's disease in that it's relatively rare, right? We know Alzheimer's disease affects about 5.8 million Americans, and it's the sixth leading cause of death in the US. So there's like recognition broadly about its impact that it has on healthcare, family needs, caregiver burden, and persons affected, right? But our best guess we have right now is that FTD probably affects about 50 to 60,000 people in the US. So that's a stark contrast when we think about how many people are affected with Alzheimer's disease, FTD. So again, when we compare FTD to Alzheimer's disease, considering again, it's the most common form of dementia for people under the age of 60, we know that it typically strikes younger, it's rare, it's far less common than Alzheimer's disease, and its symptoms are progressive and really not well understood. And this kind of really makes for a difficult and challenging disorder for health professionals, caregivers, care partners, and of course, individuals affected. So that's a long-winded explanation.
No, but that's great. I think it's really important to know how it differs because we do hear so much about Alzheimer's disease, and I think that the symptoms of Alzheimer's are becoming better known amongst our community. At least we're making a little bit of progress in that arena, and so it is really important to know. And I know you kind of described, Dina, some of the symptoms already, or some of the areas of the brain that are impacted that are different than Alzheimer's, but can you give some examples of the symptoms that are specific to FTD? And then also, can you talk about, for family caregivers, maybe start with some symptoms that are kind of first signs of FTD, and then, as person progresses, again, that's as the disease gets worse or impacts more and more of the brain. Do those symptoms change, and what are some approaches that family caregivers can take? Because I think that's the question we get most often in our live chats is, how can family caregivers approach care for their loved one, and what are the symptoms that they can expect or maybe that they're experiencing?
Yeah, so FTD is highly individualized and symptoms will look different for everyone. And they'll progress, but at different rates for everyone as well. A lot of things that are specific to FTD that we see most primarily is those behavior changes. Those are amongst the most notable symptoms that we hear from families, is that there's a change in behavior. And, that could be manifested as apathy, like a lack of interest or enthusiasm or concern, or it could be a progressive decline in socially appropriate behavior, judgment, self-control. So, someone may start to have outbursts in public or walk up to strangers and touch their hair or things like that, or just things that just aren't socially unacceptable. Or you could hear of a loved one passing and the response for someone may be that they're laughing or they just indifferent. So that's how it could manifest. Also, we typically see poor decision making or some problems with executive functioning. You may have someone in the prime of their life start to, out of nowhere, perform poorly in the workplace, or they're having trouble managing household finances, some of those things that are really controlled by our executive functioning. We see behaviors like compulsive or ritualistic behaviors. Maybe there's out of character excessive spending or the need or desire to eat the same things all the time, right? We do see problems with speech. Although people with Alzheimer's disease may have some trouble thinking of the right word or remembering names, they tend to have less difficulties making sense when they speak and understanding the speech, and then those who have FTD, right? Um, and a lot of the time, those are kind of some of the symptoms that we hear our families talk about. Most notably is the behaviors and the executive functioning start to kind of be like, something's not right. This is unusual of Jan or my husband, and like mom doesn't usually curse or behave this. And these are things that, again, are highly individualized that will progress over time and look different for every caregiver on their journeys. So some of the things that, we often echo to them is we have to think about adjusting expectations for our loved ones, right? We have to kind of deal with the ebbs and flows because it's going to be ever changing. What we may have expected from mom or dad or your wife or your husband previously is not what we could expect from them or going forward, because it'll continue to change. And be patient. That's a really, really difficult thing, to be patient with your loved one, as they're going through these changes. It's difficult for them as well. And offer yourself credit, not guilt. It's like you're doing the best that you can given the circumstances, and knowing that it's going to be different every day and continue to change. Matt, what else have you been hearing about that where we can really kind of tell our caregivers about the changes?
Well, I was thinking about one of the symptoms of FTD that can make this very difficult is something called anosognosia. So the inability to reflect on one's own actions or have insight to themselves. So you can imagine how much more complicated and difficult it would be for somebody who's displaying a lot of the symptoms that Dina was just describing, but who would have no recognition that they're doing anything wrong. And so, people will do some pretty outlandish things like eat off of other people's plates in a restaurant and then say, what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? And it can really compound the initial diagnosis as well. So oftentimes there will be this period that can sometimes be a matter of years where there's no explanation for all these bizarre behaviors, and the person who's exhibiting a lot of the bizarre behaviors is denying that there's any problem. It's not really denial in that they've actually lost the ability to recognize that their behaviors are unusual. So yeah, there's, oftentimes before people come into any care setting, they've already gone through this incredibly stressful period of upheaval. So I think one of the things diagnosis does bring is a huge sense of relief, and at least they have a name for their problem, and then they can actually then start to seek out appropriate care.
Yeah, I think that that's such an important addition that you added, Matt. And I've also heard families say, it was actually a relief when the diagnosis was made, because one woman said it saved our marriage because, I was just so confused as to why he was acting this way. And then when the diagnosis was made, it all, came into focus and everything started to kind of make sense. And so, for the families out there that are listening who are starting to recognize these symptoms in their loved one, it's really important to seek out diagnosis. And that was kind of my next question. And actually Brenda had typed in and asked, are there best tests to use that detect FTD in the early stages? But Dina, can you kind of start off the conversation? What is the diagnosis journey like? We've talked about some of the early symptoms already, but if families are recognizing that, what is the best next step? And then what can they kind of expect on that diagnosis journey?
So what we're hearing from our families is that it's really difficult to get an accurate diagnosis, and it's a very frustrating and long process, right? A family's really pushing clinicians to see changes in their loved one that can make a dozen different other medically explained symptoms.
Yeah.
And to complicate matters even more, a person can have FTD and another dementia at the same time. So the diagnostic journey, it can take about 3.5 years on average to get an FTD diagnosis compared to an Alzheimer's diagnosis, which will probably take about a little over 2.5, right? So talking about diagnostic testing, there aren't any tests that a doctor can do right now that'll say with 100% certainty your loved one has FTD. There's no single blood test, there are no biomarkers, no single imaging or screening tests that we know of currently that's going to say with 100% accuracy your loved one has FTD. A definitive diagnosis really can't be nailed down until autopsy of the brain or in familial FTD via genetic testing. Mm. Therefore, doctors have to use several methods to make clinical diagnostics testing and a clinical diagnosis. And we really recommend that the evaluation be completed by an FTD specialist. And then another thing that's important on this diagnostic journey to mention is that family input is really, really critical to the evaluation and the diagnosis process. The person that's exhibiting the symptoms, as Matt talked about, may not be aware of their changing behavior. And doctors need context to appreciate the changes that the individual might be exhibiting. So often that's part of why the reason too that diagnosis is often delayed, because there's a lot of changes that are happening over time.
Thank you so much for that information, Dina. And I think you made a really good point is caregivers play a really important role in the diagnosis, I think, of any dementia. And so a lot of times I recommend to family caregivers, if you're noticing these changes, kind of keep a little journal, you know, of what symptom, when it's happening, how frequently, because when you go in for diagnosis, that can help just provide that further evidence of the things that are experienced, that your loved one's experiencing that are outside of the norm. So I think that, you know, I have heard from families, you know, it can be so frustrating going down this diagnostic journey. And a lot of people think that they're alone in this whole process. They feel like no one else has, none of my friends or family members have talked about their loved one having these symptoms. Is this normal? And I think that's why I'm so glad that you all work for AFTD, because you have such an amazing organization with great resources and support. And so my goal today is to just shout it from the mountaintops alongside you so that people know that these resources exist. So Matt, I would love for you to tell us more about your organization and the resources that you have available for people going through the diagnosis journey once they've gotten the diagnosis and when they're kind of in full caregiving mode. What is out there?
So AFTD is still a relatively young organization. We were started in 2002, but we were growing fairly fast lately, especially. One of the main resources that we offer, and it's one that I'm most directly involved with, is our helpline. So it's a toll-free phone call or a email address where people can call or write with, you know, just about any imaginable question you can think of. You know, oftentimes the experience people have is that nobody will have ever even heard of FTD before. So one of the things our helpline does is really provide a lot of basic information and sort of help answer, you know, a lot of those very initial questions that people can't find answers to elsewhere. Currently, we're running maybe around 200 phone calls and emails a month. So we try to get back to everybody as quickly as possible. But currently, there's only 2 people who are answering our helpline. And the way it works is that it is not a live helpline, so it's not answered by a person. It goes to an answering machine where people can leave a message. And then we do our utmost to get back to people within 2 business days at the most. So we also have a small caregiver and people with FTD grant program. So it's called the Comstock Grant Program, named after our founder, Helen Ann Comstock. And there are 3 different types of financial grants we offer. One is a respite grant. So it's a $500 grant that people can apply for annually that they can use to cover the cost of any type of respite care. So that can range from overnight stay in a nursing home or a similar facility to paying a friend or neighbor to come in for an hour while somebody goes out and does the grocery shopping. So we try to make the use of the money as flexible as possible, in part because we know how hard it can be to find professionals, especially with a lot of experience in FTD. And also, sometimes the most appropriate person to provide care is somebody that the person with FTD already knows. So that can make it so much more simpler just to have a friend or family member come in and do it. And rather than trying to accustom somebody to a whole new person. The other grant that we just started that we're pretty excited about is it's called our Quality of Life grant. And this is a grant that is intended directly for people with FTD to apply for and use the funds with assistance from a caregiver or family member as needed. But it's unique in that it's delivered through a gift card. So we will actually send people a $500 Visa gift card when they're approved for the grant. And they can essentially use it however they wish, within some parameters, for whatever they need most to improve their own quality of life. And again, this ranges incredibly widely. You know, a lot of people do use it for co-pays, other medical expenses, or for the costs of equipment like incontinence products, et cetera. But other people use it for gym memberships or to cover cost of internet, cable bills. So again, we try to make the use of the funds as flexible and as individualized as possible, in part to reflect how diverse the needs are of the FTD population. And the final grant we offer is another $500 grant to cover the cost of travel to an FTD specific education event. So there aren't too many of these very specific types of events. I think majority of our travel grants go to people who want to attend our annual education conference, which we have unfortunately had to cancel this year. It was actually scheduled for next month. But so every year AFTD will put on a conference for our community. So we try to spread it out across the country in different areas of the country to give people accessibility. But the travel grant, again, is a $500 grant that people can use at their discretion. I mean, honestly, hotel room and airfare usually is about as much as that'll cover. But all the grants are available annually. And with the exception of the Quality of Life grant, they're paid through a reimbursement process. So definitely encourage people to contact the helpline for more information about how people can find application material and other details about those grants. And the other, again, main resource we offer is information through our website. So we have a lot of information on our website. Sometimes one of the critiques of our website is that it's so information dense. And really you could probably spend, sometimes I even will still find things that I didn't realize were there as they get added. So there's a lot of really great stuff on there, including a series of webinars that Dina is now putting together. They're all recorded and people can watch them, and it's a really unique source of information and education on this condition. And AFTD also does quite a bit of direct funding for medical research. So that's another really strong piece of what our organization does. So again, if you have other information, if you have any other questions or information, definitely use the helpline as the main point of contact for those types of questions.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing all of that information. I had no idea you had grants available. So that's something new I learned. I think that that's fantastic. And also, do you also have caregiver support groups that are happening across the country?
Yeah, so they're not AFTD groups, although some of them are affiliated with AFTD, which means we'll provide extra support and education to the group facilitator or leader. So the groups really are run in a variety of different formats and under different organizations, but we have them all listed on our website with direct contact information when we have it. So the name, email, and or phone number for the person to contact for more information. At the risk of not being exactly correct, I'll say I think there's about 85 different FTD specific groups that we know of across the country. And in addition to these face-to-face groups, AFTD does offer a handful of different phone support groups. So these are monthly support groups that meet by phone. And we also have one group that's specifically for people who are diagnosed with FTD that meets by Zoom. So so far, that's the only group that meets by video conference. The others are still phone conferences. There are some of the phone groups are specifically for people who are facing the behavioral challenges associated with FTD. There's a group that is specifically for people with language challenges, sort of the subset of FTD that goes under the term primary progressive aphasia. There's now a group for people who are facing the overlap between FTD and ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, which is another subpopulation. And we know of a group that's run not by AFTD, but it's specifically for adult children with a parent who's affected. So we do try to have targeted specific groups as much as possible. But there may be a waiting list for some of these groups, but again, the helpline's the point of contact for more information details about how that works.
Well, thanks so much for that information. I know that, coming alongside other people going through a similar experience can be so powerful. Like I mentioned earlier, so many people feel like they're so alone. So knowing that these resources exist, the grants and the hotline and support group, hopefully is all welcomed resources for all that are listening today. I'm really curious, Matt, is there any specific questions that you get most often on your hotline that you might just want to share some quick info on, just so people kind of know what questions are they able to ask? What are some of the commonly asked questions?
Yeah, thank you. And I've always been surprised by how varied it is. So there's not like even one or two questions that stand out far above the rest. But certainly one of the things people will contact for is help looking for community resources, anything from doctors to day programs. And I'll also add that one of the ways we use our support groups is as a sort of an information hub. So, there aren't a lot of professionals out there. Quite frankly, I've never seen any professional out there advertising FTD services. It's usually all under the umbrella of Alzheimer's or memory care. But there certainly are a lot of people out there who have developed some expertise with FTD. And it's just a matter of trying to find them. So the support groups is often where we will direct people who are even just looking for resources, just so they could get some suggestions or referral. So it's really word of mouth, how those referrals work. Another big need that we're aware of through the helpline is people looking for residential care. And this is a problem that I'm afraid just doesn't have a good answer yet. But if you can imagine a 35-year-old with dementia looking for residential care, and their only option is memory care, really. And that creates a whole host of issues to have somebody that young, that able, living amongst generally older, more frail population, especially when you throw in some of the behavioral symptoms of FTD on top of that. So it's one of the calls that I like the least, because I don't have a good answer for people. And really, people have to be as creative as they possibly can. Oftentimes it requires a partnership between families and residential facilities to make a placement work. But that's certainly one of the questions that comes up a lot through our helpline. We also often get the question as, I think my husband, wife, spouse, uncle, brother has FTD. So people who have been noticing changes and symptoms probably have Googled something and come up with our name, and they call our helpline for more details. So that's also where our knowledge and relationships with medical specialists across the country come in as well. So AFTD does have a pretty close relationship with neurologists who are doing FTD research, primarily because we fund a lot of that research. So we know a lot of the people who are the most knowledgeable in the field as neurologists. And for the most part, they will do diagnostic services for just about anybody who has a concern. So there's, again, not all that many of them, but we list medical research centers on our website. And whenever possible, we say, get a second opinion from one of these people, or go directly to their center if you can. We realize that, there are some parts of the country where there's really not a lot of options in terms of FTD specialists. But another interesting question we get a lot is brain donation, which I think is kind of funny in that sometimes we've even gotten calls from morticians and people and pathologists saying, we have this person's brain and we want to send it to you. So
interesting.
Yeah, I think people have somehow got a misconception of our role in this. We know of repositories, researchers, as well as a couple of organizations that have been created specifically to help people and facilitate the process of conducting a brain tissue sample donation for FTD research. But we are very much the middlemen. So we just put the people together and we don't have a direct role in it. But certainly the NIH has increased their interest in tissue samples for these, what they often refer to as the related dementias or the Alzheimer's related dementias. So NIH does still, will accept tissue. And they have developed their own nonprofit organization called the Brain Donor Project to help facilitate that donation. And, another important function of our helpline is just that it provides a sympathetic ear from somebody who, really understands how hard FTD can be. So oftentimes what we do on our helpline is we just listen, give people a sounding board to bounce ideas off of, or just someone who will understand and be sympathetic to what they're going through.
Wow, it sounds like this hotline serves such an important need in this community. And thank you for sharing those commonly asked questions. The brain donation one, I didn't anticipate being a commonly asked question, but it is something that I'm sure people want to help. They want to further the research in this area. Well, actually, I have a question about clinical trials in just a little bit. But before we get to that, I know you have mentioned, there are a limited number of professionals out there, medical professionals that truly understand this disease and have the expertise to make the diagnosis. But I know that AFTD is working to educate professionals in the medical field and in kind of this whole realm. And Dina, you have a newsletter, which I'm very excited. I'm going to subscribe to because you have such great information. And so can you talk a little bit for those professionals on the line about the newsletter and other opportunities for education? And I think if I remember correct, anyone can sign up for the newsletter. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Anybody can sign up to the newsletter. In fact, a lot of our readers are both healthcare professionals and caregiver and care partners. So yes, anybody can sign up for these newsletters. The newsletter itself is called Partners in FTD Care. And it's a quarterly published e-newsletter really highlighting specific challenges and issues related to FTD care. So the newsletter itself has a case which presents the actual challenge, along with discussion questions and suggested information and interventions, and additional education materials highlighted as side articles. And these materials really can be used to guide healthcare professionals in their specific approaches to care. And also, we see them utilized by care partners who will read the information, take it to their healthcare professional and be like, hey, you know, this is kind of what we're experiencing, you know. The next Partners in FTD Care installment is actually slated to come out March 30th. Hopefully it won't get pushed back, but this one will really highlight what we are calling resistant behaviors in the home care setting. So it'd be a very interesting read for anybody that's interested and you'd like to subscribe to Partners in FTD Care. Just send an email to partnersinftdcare@theaftd.org and we'll get you subscribed to that. Another educational initiative that we have at the AFTD, which you alluded to a little earlier, is our educational webinars. They too are quarterly. We actually have one later this evening, which is on CBD or cortical basal degeneration. And they too focus on a specific aspect of the FTD disorders where we have an invited guest expert talk about and educate our community about that specific issue, challenge, or subset of FTD.
Wonderful. Well, and we put some links in the chat box and out on Facebook where you can go to learn more about these wonderful opportunities for education. And it also, I love newsletters because it just helps you stay connected to the organization and that community, and you can get so much great information. So Dina, thank you so much for sharing about that. And then before we go and open it up for questions, Matt, I want to get back to that clinical trial participation. Can you tell us a little bit more? I know you mentioned that AFTD funds a lot of research. So if people are wanting to participate in clinical trials, what's the best way for them to go about it?
At this point, I think probably the best first step is to sign up for our FTD disorders registry. So this is a fairly new database that was created in partnership with a couple other organizations. And it's meant to essentially be a research registry. So a site where people can basically sign up to get the news about clinical trials as they develop. There certainly is a lot of information that is captured by the registry, and people with FTD can register. Care partners can register both for themselves and for their loved one. And it will hopefully capture a lot of basic natural history information, but part of its intention is to develop sort of a ready to go communication network so that when clinical trials especially are available, the news can kind of get disseminated as quickly as possible and people can find out more details about how to participate. You know, currently there are a few fairly small trials going on, but the eligibility criteria tend to be pretty strict, and it's not intended for a very large population. A lot of the research that's going on now currently, and the focus of AFTD's granting right now is actually on biomarkers. And, you know, given how difficult diagnosis is in FTD, one of the real main priorities simply is to develop biomarkers, which are essentially any physical, anything physical that can be measured that will reveal some aspect of FTD. So sort of one of the holy grails in biomarkers is a diagnostic test that could diagnose FTD definitively through something as simple as a blood test or something like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of the research that's being done now is on finding biomarkers to help with clinical trials so that when a drug is developed, they'll be able to measure some aspect of the physiology that shows the effect of the drug and be able to develop the data. So that's, there are a variety of biomarker research projects going on, and you can find out more about them again on our website. We have a whole section of the website devoted to research, including a page of featured studies that talks about new and upcoming research projects. And another good source of information on medical research is a website called clinicaltrials.gov. It's a clearinghouse that is developed through the federal government that lists medical research on just about anything. So it's got, cancer, everything you can think of, but you can search it. So if you simply go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in something like frontotemporal dementia, you'll get a list of studies that includes study sites as well as contact information for who to call to get enrolled in the project.
Matt, thank you so much for that great information. And we have been posting a lot of links in the comment section and in the chat box. So please feel free to scroll through there so that you can find all of these great resources that we've been mentioning. And so now we're going to open up questions. We've already had some great questions that are coming into us. So I'm going to start with those. But if you have a question and you're joining us on Zoom, you can type it into the chat box or the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can just type your question in the comment section below, and we're gonna get to as many of them as we possibly can by the end of this chat. So the first question that we have comes to us through. Pardon me, I'm just scrolling through. We've had so many great comments come in. So Matt, you had mentioned the grants, and somebody was asking, what are there, certain requirements? Does it require a diagnosis, a physician's letter? And maybe instead of going into all the specifics, is there just a place that people can go to get that information on the requirements for these various grants?
Yeah, the grants are on our website under the resources tab. So there's a page for Comstock grants that lists out the details for each separate grant. But in short, the only eligibility is that people can provide documentation of an FTD diagnosis.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Charles. He says, are there any specific physical exercise programs that have been recommended to address FTD? So can either of you speak to that? I know that, exercise is generally good for all of us, but in the FTD world, is there anything specific or any resources that you can recommend in that regard?
So far, I don't know of anything FTD specific. Prevention, and especially physical exercise, is an area of increasing interest. But up to this point, most of the work has been done in Alzheimer's disease. So while there hasn't been a lot of concrete evidence, I believe one of the most well-supported pieces is that regulating blood pressure can have a positive effect on preventing dementia. And you can certainly make the assumption that that applies to FTD, but there hasn't been actual research to back that up yet.
Okay. Well, yeah, and everyone is so individualized, as we talked about. This disease impacts everyone so differently. And, and physical exercise, we know this is kind of across the board in dementia, might be great for people, in the early stages of the disease, and maybe even in the middle or moderate stage, but it might not be feasible. So it's really important for families to talk to their healthcare provider and also to just kind of monitor day to day, and every day could be different. One day they could be really up for going out for a walk, and the next day they might not have the energy. So I think it's important for families to kind of take it day by day and really meet their loved one where they're at, or the care recipient where they're at on that day, as to whether or not they engage in exercise. But we thank you for writing in that question. I believe Iris wrote that in, so thank you so much, Iris. And then we have Cindy on Facebook. She's wondering if there is an FTD specialist in Connecticut. And I don't want to get into a lot of specifics on, state by state, but on your website, is there a place people can go to find FTD specialists? I know you mentioned there's research centers across the nation, but can you speak maybe a little more to that?
Go ahead.
Gina, do you want to take that?
Okay.
Yeah, Matt can take it. Because I know there's, go ahead.
I think there's a tab called Find Help where you can search by state.
Yes.
And then we will list both support groups as well as medical centers, either in the state you've searched for or in nearby states.
Right.
So
Fantastic.
that's where to go for that information.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, so we have another question that's coming from Jane. And she's asking, this is a pretty specific question. So if we don't have an answer, maybe we can send her in the right direction. And it's coming into the Q&A box. So I know I mentioned to you both, I would monitor it, but there's a very long word that I'm not sure how to pronounce. So if you have a chance to peek at it real quick, but Jane is asking, would brain changes like post-mini stroke have an impact maybe on FTD or I think it's leukorrhiosis? I apologize, I probably butchered the spelling of that. Are you familiar with that? Is that related to FTD in any way?
There isn't, I think, a direct connection between stroke and FTD. And I'll admit I'm not sure what leukorrhiosis refers to.
Right.
But in general, people are beginning to realize that stroke and cardiovascular issues are sort of the wild card in just about any type of dementia.
Right.
And they can certainly contribute to symptoms. So there can be symptoms that are specifically contributable to a stroke, as well as makes existing dementia symptoms even worse. So what used to be called vascular dementia is actually, I've heard it now referred to as vascular contributions to dementia, in that it really applies across the board in ways that are really very unpredictable and very individualized as well.
Thank you for answering that. And Jane, we hope that that's helpful to you. Okay, so Jennifer's asking, would you expect to see the behaviors such as paranoia and other types of, so paranoia, and she said the smearing of bodily fluid or feces as a behavior experience with FTD. I know, again, this is pretty specific, but
again, symptoms are highly individualized. We do hear from some of our families there are issues with paranoia, delusions. Again, highly individualized. It absolutely could be a symptom for your individualized loved one who may have FTD. Some of these bizarre behaviors, like the smearing of the bodily fluids, could be a symptom of that individual. Again, it's really hard to say yay or nay because it's so individualized. So it could possibly be a symptom.
Thank you, Dina. We hope that that's helpful to you, Jennifer. We have Jane asking, do you know of any Canadian partners that do similar work to your organization?
Oh,
Do you know of any?
Canadian.
No. We can always get back to the community on this.
Yeah.
The closest that I'm aware of is the Alzheimer's Society. So it's sort of the Canadian version of the Alzheimer's Association, but there isn't a nonprofit specifically for frontotemporal in Canada as far as we're aware of.
Okay, thank you for that. And then Doug has asked, are there any resources specific to those who are experiencing very early onset, like in their 20s and 30s?
So resources as far as support or resources as far as education. If they're looking for support, there's support groups that they could check out, of course, too, on our website, too. We have some specific support groups that our helpline advisor would be able to connect her with. As far as education, I think all of the education on our website is applicable because we know this is a disease that is something that strikes people who are younger, as early as 20. So all the information there, education-wise, is certainly applicable.
Thanks, Dina. And just as a shout out to both of you, Jill wrote in and said, thanks so much, this is really good information. So we're really glad that people are taking a lot away. I know I'm firing a lot of questions at you, so I just wanted to give you a thumbs up. You guys are doing an awesome job. But Gina just wrote in, she said, does FTD run in families? I know that when we look at other types of dementia, family history can increase a person's risk. Is the same true for FTD?
So we do know genetics do play a role in FTD. Some cases can be sporadic, which means they can happen without any kind of familial link. And some cases can be linked to families and familials. So we do know genetics can play a role in FTD. Sometimes some cases will have that familial link, but that's when we start to get into genetic testing and things like that.
And I'll also add that there is currently a large-scale research project that's looking specifically at genetic of cases of FTD. So it's I believe it's all called All FTD right now. It's just sort of getting underway, so definitely look for more information about that, because one of the arms of that research is specifically on familial FTD.
That's great to know. Yeah, I know there are similar studies happening in Alzheimer's disease where they're tracking familial links and does it run in people's families and following families in which there is kind of a history of grandma had it, mom had it, now adult daughter is worried she's going to get it. So, you know, if you do have a history of it in your family, that might be a great study to keep your eye out for. So thanks so much for answering Gina's question. And I think we'll have time for just one last question. It's coming to us via Facebook. Nikki wrote in. She said her husband was diagnosed about 2 years ago at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, but she knew that it started before then, and that's the reason that they took him there. She says, any idea on how far back FTD starts? I know in the Alzheimer's world, researchers are starting to think that it's, you know, the disease in the brain is starting, you know, maybe 10 to 20 years before the first symptom even starts. So do we see the same kind of thing in FTD?
Yes, but it's again, it's sort of a developing area. And actually that's where genetics plays a really important part, because that allows research to identify people who have a genetic predisposition to the disease so that they can actually try and track those very, very initial changes. And part of the reason that's becoming so important is that, you know, I think people are realizing that it's going to be almost impossible to cure these diseases in the sense of being able to repair damage that has already been done. So if you can identify people who are at higher risk for developing dementia of any sort, then they can develop treatments that can be started at the very, 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 very first signs of the disease that are usually, you know, have to do with molecular changes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much, like you mentioned, you know, your organization is a fairly young organization, and this study of dementia and the studying of the brain is really kind of in its kind of elementary years or in its infancy compared to other types of diseases like cancer and HIV and AIDS and that sort of thing. So we're, as a dementia community and a research community, we're learning more and more. So it is a very exciting time. I don't know if you feel it, but I feel a lot of hope for the future when it comes to diagnosis and better understanding this disease and the resources that are becoming available to families. I think we're just kind of at the forefront of this large knowledge discovery that we'll only see benefits from going forward.
Agreed. Yeah. And if you guys, for any of your viewers out there, if they're really interested in staying up to date on all AFTD happenings, they can absolutely sign up for our monthly newsletter called Help and Hope. It's on AFTD's homepage. If they scroll to the bottom, there's a little icon that says Find Help and like a little computer icon where they can put in their email address to sign up for our monthly newsletter to help them stay up to date with all of the things that we talked about today and some of the up and coming things on the horizon that AFTD is doing in our community.
Fantastic. Well, we thank you both so much for being with us today. Just as a reminder to all of you, this was recorded and we'll be sending out the recording to those of you on Zoom. We'll do a follow-up email For those of you on Facebook, we're going to post this back out there on Facebook, so feel free to share it. And if you're not following AFTD, they have a great Facebook page. I liked their page, but you can also, I did, and I like getting the updates that way. And then if you haven't already followed our Home Instead channels, remember for Alzheimer's, while it has the word Alzheimer's in it, we focus on all dementias, and that's a great way to keep up on all that we're doing. We host these live chats every month, so we pick a different topic each month, and we will have one coming up in April. We'll get the information out there, but we do try to change it up from month to month. Last month, we had a woman living with dementia who shared her story. This month, we're focusing on a specific type of dementia, FTD, and in our future chats, we hope to cover things like hearing loss and dementia and activities to do with your loved one, indoor and outdoor. So we really try to make it accessible and fun and change it up and bring you information that you will find helpful in your everyday caregiving journey. So with that, we hope that you all have a wonderful day. Matt and Dina, thank you again so much for being with us and sharing your resources and your expertise. I've really enjoyed it. And I wish you both just a great rest of your day and a great week.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye, everyone. Take care.